Well, thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. I'm so excited to be here with Karin. All right, so Karin, can we just dive right in here?
Sure.
Let's start at the very beginning. Pieces of Her opens with a scene that feels incredibly raw and very timely, unfortunately. Can you kind of describe this scene to us and explain where you got the idea to start your novel this way?
Well, it's not giving too much away, I think, unless you're the kind of person who doesn't want to know anything about the book. But it's pretty much in the jacket. If you don't like that, then I'll point out my editor to you later. So Andy is a young woman. She's 31 years old, and it's her birthday, and her mother is doing what moms do, which is taking her to brunch. And they're at the shopping mall and at the diner. You know, everybody's been to a shopping mall and a restaurant that's open to the mall. And Andrea's getting the talk from her mom about how maybe it's time for her to move out of the house and start her life, which I think a lot of elder millennials can relate to hearing that. I actually had a friend whose son did an internship, and he came back, and she had sold the house and moved into a condo. And he couldn't understand why it was only a one-bedroom. And she said, that's the only way I could get you out of the basement. But that's another story. But so Andrea and Laura, her mother, are having this conversation, and then suddenly a guy walks in with a gun and starts firing at people. And, you know, I was thinking about this because if I had written an opening like that in my first book, which was 18 years ago, the whole focus of the book would have been that crime, because it would have been so shocking and horrific that it would have to be what the book was about. But because, I mean, not that it's commonplace, but it happens a lot, it was something I could use as a springboard into something else. So what happens is Andy runs and hides, and Laura, the mother, doesn't run and hide. She confronts the killer, and she fights back. And this shows Andy a side of her mother that she's never seen before. You know, Laura's the quintessential PTA mom. She sews dresses for Andy on her birthdays so that she can have Wuthering Heights themed parties. And actually, she's like the greatest mom that nobody ever had, because she's just, you know, the cool mom everybody can talk to, and she listens to Beyonce. It's shocking for Andy to see her do this. And for me, that was a good way to just kind of get into the book, was have this horrible thing happen where Andy realizes that her mother isn't the person she thought she was. And as the book progresses, she realizes that her mother might actually be a really bad person.
We were actually just talking about this before, but we were saying how it's so interesting how crime books are becoming more focused on these sort of mother-daughter relationships. And your last standalone, it dealt with a father-daughter relationship. So why did you feel like now was the right moment to switch gears and to look at this mother-daughter relationship?
Well, we read lots of crime novels, and I was saying that not trusting your parents is the new not trusting your husband. You know, the fact is, every adult has a moment in their life where they think, holy crap, my parent lived a life before me. And that came to me when my stepmother was telling me about when she first met my father and how he had a mirrored headboard in his apartment. And I said, let me stop you right there. Because, you know, there are just certain things you don't want to know, like that my stepmother had met a guy in high school who had a motorcycle and a van. I mean, what kind of crazy person was she? But, you know, those are the things we don't want to think about. And I think as parents, you don't want your kid to know that you tried cocaine once in high school, or all these crazy things that normal people do. So I was thinking about that moment when I started the book of, you know, you don't know your parent. And of course, since this is a thriller, I have to make something really awful happen to magnify that revelation.
So let's talk about Andrea for a minute. We'll get back to Laura. There are kind of two levels of character development happening in the story. There's this idea of unpacking exactly who Laura is, her backstory. But what I actually loved the most, I think, was Andrea, kind of the arc of her development. It felt like in a lot of ways there's kind of a coming of age story happening here. And I was wondering if you could describe for us what interested you so much in Andrea that you wanted to make her development such a focal point.
Well, part of it was I just wanted to understand, because, you know, I know every generation thinks that the one after them is kind of useless and they don't really understand the world. But I'm right. But I mean, honestly, you know, and I talk about generational differences with music taste, for instance, throughout the book. And I know with my nieces, I mean, they're so smart, they're so accomplished, and they've grown up being told they can do anything. You know, you can be a doctor or a lawyer, or well, you still can't be president, but they've been told that all the options are on the table. And when I was growing up, and I think a lot of women, judging by some of the gray hair and some of the artfully covered gray hair in here, that we were told, well, you know, you could maybe be a dental hygienist or a nurse or a librarian, and then hopefully when you get out of college, you'll meet a nice man and he'll take care of you and you can raise a family. And so just the different messages that was something I wanted to talk about. And also this sort of decision paralysis that a lot of young people, not just young women, have, because there's all this opportunity that they're told they have, but in real life, the choices are still sort of narrowed, whether it's because they're crippled by college debt or because the jobs that people their age used to have don't exist anymore, or whatever reason, and also because they can live in their parents' house rent-free with no stigma, which I certainly couldn't do. I remember when I graduated, the night of my graduation, my father held me and he kissed me on the head and he said, "Sweetheart, the world is yours. You can do whatever you want. You just cannot move back home." And so, you know, by God, I had a job the next day. So with Andrea, she's going through these struggles that my generation really didn't. I mean, and to discount them because they weren't my struggles, I think, is a disservice. Because these are real things. You know, college loan debt is massive. And so, yeah, you graduate and you're a doctor, but now you owe $250,000, and you have to go into a specialty you hate to pay that off. Welcome to adulthood. It's everything we promised. And that's what Andrea is dealing with. But, you know, one thing I've noticed, I tour a lot overseas. Every country I've ever toured in, they have the equivalent of the phrase helicopter parent. In Denmark, they call them curling parents, you know, like the curling sport where they clear the way. And I think I understand that need to make things easy, but for a kid like Andrea, things have been made so easy that she really doesn't know what to do when bad things start to happen. And so really witnessing her mother turn into this cold-blooded maniac is probably the best thing that ever happened to her, because then suddenly Andy's on the run for her life and she has to get away from her family and her safety net. And the further she gets away, the stronger she becomes. So if you're really looking to get rid of your kids and you don't want to move, then you should kill somebody in front of them.
So do you see yourself in Laura or Andy?
Wow. I feel like, are there any police officers here? I always see bits and pieces of myself in my characters. I think that's what makes me love them, because all authors are they have their own agenda. They're putting their own thing into the characters, and especially the characters they like. And I really like Andy a lot. And the fact that she has this job where she works at night, and what she's done is she just sleeps all day and she steals things from her mother's refrigerator because she doesn't want to put on real clothes and go outside and get groceries. I can really relate to that. Because, I mean, what a life, right? I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? But also in a lot of ways I can relate to Laura because she owns her own business. I mean, people don't think about it, but authors are basically self-employed. And she's trying to do the best, and she's trying to make up for things that she's done in the past. And to me, that's a universal thing. You know, everybody in here has probably done something stupid or artlessly mean to someone and didn't really mean it and lost the opportunity to apologize for it or make amends. And it's something you carry with you the rest of your life, even if you're not cognizant of it every day. So that's something I related to with Laura.
I think what I loved about both these characters is, they're both really complicated. They have a lot of good and bad. And I was wondering, do you see them as sympathetic characters, or do they need to be sympathetic?
I've never worried about people liking or sympathizing with my characters. Years ago I heard someone, a famous writer, I should remember her name. Well, she doesn't know mine, so that's okay. Say that when women create unlikable characters, people always think it's a mistake. And one of my first characters I created in my Grant County series, why would you like her? I mean, she's an awful person, and that was very deliberate on my part. And I like writing characters that it's a challenge for people to like. It's really interesting to me because I've been touring with this book overseas where it's been out for a month or so, and I can always tell which side of the divide a reader is on by their age group. Because the older women love Laura and the younger women love Andy because they feel like Andy's speaking to them in a way that they understand. I think 30 in some ways is the equivalent of what 20 used to be, which is great if you're 60, right? But I think just where especially women are in their lives, they're having children later, they're settling down later. But I think all of that's awful, crazy stuff you go through in your 20s. Now I think a little of it's happening well into your 30s. And I think that for older women who didn't have the luxury of doing that, it makes them very annoyed. It's like you watch Girls and you think, why wasn't I having sex with 60 people every Saturday, or why wasn't I drinking to black? I had to go to college. I had to get a job, So maybe there's a little anger there because they're jealous. But it is interesting because it is a clear divide. And I was conscious of that when I was writing Andy, that if you didn't like her initially, that you wanted to find out what she's doing next. And I think that's what you have to do with characters who aren't meant to be your best friend, right? You have to give them a story and clues to find. And with Andy in particular, you're getting pieces about Laura and who she used to be and the mistakes she made in her life. So, those are the things that I kind of use to buy your favor until you actually see Andy start doing things you agree with, and then hopefully you're rooting for her.
Well, I was Team Andy, so I feel like I'm proving your point here. So one of the things that I loved about this book, and I think it's true of a lot of psychological suspense novels right now, is they're all looking at this sort of big question, which is, what if you don't know the person who you think you know the best as well as you did? And I'm wondering, why do you think readers keep coming back to suspense novels with that theme?
Well, the thing is, a lot of writers are writing it, and a lot of them are men who are using women's names because they think it's marketing, right, to do this sort of thing. And that if one book was really successful with this theme, that they should do it as well. So I think that's part of it. But I also think, one of the things that really shocked me when I first started writing and talked to people in law enforcement, like the FBI and my local police, was whenever something really horrific happens, you would be shocked at the number of women who call in on the help hotline and say, I think it was my husband, or I think it was my boyfriend. And, people who've been married for 20 years, and they're like, well, he could be a serial rapist. I don't know, So, the fact that this happened, and we're not talking about one or two, we're talking about hundreds call in and say, it could be my husband. He says he's out, but who knows? He spends a lot of time in the garage. So I think that's maybe something women think about. But I also think it's generational too. I don't think young women are doing that as much because the men in their lives can't get away with just disappearing into the garage for 3 hours. They're looking at porn. They're not murdering people. Or they're just like enjoying the silence, which wouldn't that be great if you could do that for 2 hours a day? But I think that, it is something that a lot of people think about. And so I think that's why the books really hit at the right time, even with Gillian Flynn or Leanne Moriarty, especially after the Me Too movement, where women are talking about these sorts of things happening every single day. So that might be part of it.
So Pieces of Her is a story that is really big in scope. You're taking readers from Georgia, literally around the world, into this kind of counterculture activist group. And I'm wondering, this felt like a big shift for me as a reader from your previous novels. Why was this kind of large scope important? What did it allow you to explore in your story that you couldn't have done in just one small town?
Well, I mean, primarily Will Trent is not going to get on an airplane. I mean, let's face that fact. I mean, he might to go to Tennessee if there's a crime that has something to do with Georgia, but the scope of it is very different, and that was deliberate on my part. You know, I wrote The Good Daughter last year, and I was really proud of that. But it was a very insular, small town, very personal, very deeply, darkly psychological story. And I wanted something different from that. I wanted it to be big in scope. I wanted it to be shocking and surprising. I love crime fiction. I've read it since I was a kid. It's my favorite genre. I read it all the time. But I know the patterns that a lot of these crime novels follow. And sometimes, you know, it's fantastic. I mean, I read The Next Lee Child, and spoiler alert, Reacher goes to a small town and bad things are happening and he straightens it out, right? But I loved it. It was such a great read, and Lee is still so passionate about telling these stories. He's always finding new angles into that, and it really works. But for me, I want to try different things each time. And with this book, I thought, you know, I've been touring for so many years in the United States. We live in such a beautiful, diverse country, and I want to have a road trip. You know, I've been to every state in the Union on a book tour except for Alaska. And so I thought, let me write about some of these places I've been to, like Austin, Texas, or Muscle Shoals, Alabama, going up into Arkansas, Chicago, all those cool places, because I just thought it would be really fun and I had the right story for it. Because that's the thing, you know, you could want with all your heart to write this big kind of novel that has this road trip, but if you can't find the right plot and the right characters, it's never going to work. And that just kind of lined up for me.
And one of the things that ties it all together, and without spoiling exactly how it's connected, but there's a fantastic, unique component to the story that is this kind of activist group that almost becomes kind of culty, I think it's fair to say. And I was just wondering where the idea for this group came about, and is it based on a real story you read or a real case?
I think that if you put a gun to my head and asked me to tell my favorite stories, well, let's do it this way. My editor, who's been editing me since the second book, if you told her what are Karin's favorite stories, she would say incest and cult stories. Let me explain. So I grew up reading Flowers in the Attic. And I did not realize until I was in college in a feminist studies class, which will make you hate feminists and studies. And someone was talking about Flowers in the Attic and how disgusting it was. And I was like, oh my God, it's incest. It just occurred to me at the age of 19 that it wasn't a beautiful love story. I mean, because what choice did they have, right? They were young men and women. They were locked up. See, she's nodding. And between that and General Hospital, you know, if you watched General Hospital when you were my age at 13, when Luke met Laura, he raped her violently. And then it was a beautiful love story because they ended up getting married. So this was the sort of stuff, these were the positive messages I got as a young woman. But I've always been fascinated by cults. One of the first true crime novels I read was about the Manson crime, Helter Skelter. And I just the idea of completely giving up your autonomy and your agency is just shocking to me, you know. And I think that the cults have always existed. And, you know, I love that Wild Country. I mean, it's just fascinating because they all think that they are the ones who know the truth and everybody else is stupid, which is how I thought when I was in the 6th grade. And then I figured out, no, you're the stupid one. Everybody else has it figured out, you know? So what makes people think that they're the special ones, right? And I think what it takes is a very charismatic leader who's also a predator, who understands people are missing things in their lives. And he's very good. It's usually a he because he wants to have sex with all the girls. But he's very good at figuring out what's missing and giving you that missing thing just enough so you stick around, right? Because you can't give it to them all the time because then they won't trust you. So you have to give it in little bits and pieces. And that's always been something that I was interested in studying and knowing more about. You know, Patty Hearst is a great example of this, that story. The Jeff Toobin book was amazing, American Heiress. And also, you know, I I was a teenager in the late 1980s, and I remember there were radical groups then, like ACT UP, and people who were really angry, rightfully so, about what was going on in the world, and were ready to bring down the world just to stop it from happening. And I think we've always had those sorts of groups on both sides of the political spectrum who are just willing to do what they think it takes to make people change and wake up. It doesn't work. It never works. That's not how you do it. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. had the right idea there on how to change things. But I'm just fascinated by that, and I blame V.C. Andrews.
I think the psychology of the cult in the story was fascinating to me, and it felt unfortunately a bit timely, and not to get super political, but there's this kind of group think that you watch develop, and it felt very frightening to see how that could happen. And I was just wondering if there's kind of a message or anything that you hope readers would take away from watching the progression of how this group kind of comes together and kind of melds into this one way of looking at the world.
Well, I think what it means is people are desperate. And I don't want in any way for anyone to think I'm making a comparison, but very early on when Obama was running, I think a lot of people were excited about the cult of personality of him. And then they realized he was a politician, and they were like, oh, what? And I think that we're seeing the same thing happen, and with Trump. But I think that that's very dangerous to think that someone is infallible. And the thing about politicians is they are always going to prove that they are fallible eventually, hopefully on video. But I think in a weird way, when we're in a bad situation, we want this sort of Messiah-like character. I mean, it's the story of Christianity, right? Is someone's going to save us from this misery that we're in. And again, when I'm talking about what's going on in the book, the character in the book who is susceptible to this is someone who has had a very damaged life. And I've talked to people at the FBI who deal with cults. There are so many cults that you have no idea exist. I mean, remember how surprising it was when the Heaven's Gate people committed suicide? They had existed for years, and no one knew about them until they had this mass suicide. There are all kinds of people in these groups, some smaller than others, in the United States, in Europe, who exist today. So it did feel topical in a way, because I think that from what I've heard FBI agents who track this say, that the membership in cult groups has risen because people are just looking for answers.
Pieces of Her encompasses something that I personally love, maybe most of all, about crime fiction, which is that it can, within this one crime novel, hold so many different types of stories. And I think as a reader, it feels like you can pick up a crime novel, you can pick up a couple crime novels, and they don't necessarily have to follow the same formula. And I was wondering, as a writer, do you feel the same way, or do you ever feel constrained by the idea of writing a genre novel?
Well, I've never felt constrained. I love crime fiction. I think it's great that I am marketed as a crime fiction writer, because crime fiction sells the most books. Sometimes people in crime fiction, I know you've run into this, they have this chip on their shoulder and they say, I'm writing literature. And it's right. Technically everybody's writing literature, that's what books are, right? And I've never really been bothered by being put in these boxes. If you say to me, who do you think in 100 years is going to be taught in high schools? I would say Stephen King, probably, without a doubt. I mean, the man knows how to write characters. He has captured a certain part of America in his books that history books cannot tell you. And that's what Dickens did. That's what The Great Gatsby is all about. People forget Gatsby was a thug. He was not a charming, handsome, wealthy guy. He was a criminal. And that really tells you what life was like in New York at that time, or East Egg or whatever. So to me, that's what I think about. Great Gatsby, that's a crime novel. There's murder in there. One of the funniest things I ever saw was at the Library of Congress, and I looked at how The Great Gatsby was categorized, and it said murder, car accident. And I thought, well, that's great. That's some intern had fun categorizing that. I was really curious how I was categorized, but I didn't have time to look. The categories are just that, and crime novels are hybrids. Leanne Moriarty, she's definitely writing love stories. She's writing something that people weren't really writing at the time, which is women who really love their husbands, which is very hard to do. Nobody really wants to read about happy people, and she's good at doing that. And she's good at writing men who respect women. And people always say, well, why is Leanne Moriarty so popular? And it's because she's writing aspirational relationships, right? And the bad things that happen are never really bad. Or it's sort of the Agatha Christie way of killing people. They really deserve to die, so it's okay. That's definitely different kinds of novels in one. And Gillian Flynn's the same way. I mean, she's been writing social stories for a really long time, almost polemics about the crazy, awful things people do to each other. And that's how I feel when I'm writing. I don't feel constrained. I've never felt like my publisher has said to me, you've got to write the next Gone Girl. Because I think they understand that Gillian didn't know she was writing Gone Girl when she wrote it. You can't really chase that, or if you do, you can only do it once and you don't have much of a career after that. So for me, I write the story that I, as a crime reader, would want to read.
Speaking of the terrible things that people do to each other, one of my favorite things about your books is that they are super dark. You guys have read Karin before, these are violent books. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the role of violence in your stories. And, are there lines that you won't cross? Are there kind of guidelines you keep in your own head while you're writing these scenes?
Well, yeah, believe it or not. I think every writer has their own moral compass. And I would never say that I wouldn't write about something, because I think that's the worst thing I can do, because if I say I'll never write about children being murdered, then suddenly that night I'll have a great story about children being murdered, just because I hate being told what to do, even if it's myself saying don't do it. And I am the person who wrote the story about the two brothers who were very close. One was a serial killer, one was very religious, but they were conjoined twins. So honestly, there's not something I won't write about. But yeah, conjoined. And I think it's important to tell the story. Every author, when they start a book, has to decide the level of honesty they're going to employ in that book. Are they going to be as realistic as possible? Are they going to be fun? I love Janet Ivanovich. I read every single one of her books, but when I finish it, I can't tell you if Stephanie's with Ranger or Joe or with both of them, which is gross. And I'm excited about the next one. But when I'm writing my books, I feel like writing about, especially if the book has violence against women, I want to show it for what it is, and I want to use the language of what it is. I don't want to soften it, because, it's kind of like the whole Al Franken versus Roy Moore thing. Well, you can both say both of them are, one, idiots, but sexual harassers. But if you know the details of the stories of the two men, they're on very different spectrums. And using that language in a specific way tells you, as a reader, what you should be outraged about and why the characters are behaving the way they do. So I chose from a very early point to be as honest as I could about what was happening, why the characters were furious about it, why they were devastated, and what it did to the investigators, because that's something else that interests me. When I was growing up, my stepmother's sister was the chief of detectives in the town next to ours, and I saw how that affected her, and I wanted to write about that effect.
That was actually, you touched on what was going to be my next question, which is I feel like there's been a ton of conversation lately about the role of violence against women in crime fiction. And as a female crime writer, writing crime novels that are very female-centric, what kind of relationship do you want your female characters, in this case, Laura and Andy, what kind of relationship do you want them to have to violence?
Well, when I write my stories, I take the Mary Higgins Clark approach. And if you love Mary like I do, you notice in her books, the woman is never saved in the end by a man. She saves herself. And that was something I felt strongly about, is I'm going to be writing about some awful things. You know, not all my books have women as victims. I never get credit for killing all the men I kill. I kill quite a few. No one thinks it's tragic. You know, to the men in the audience, I'm sorry, your death will not be as impactful as the woman next to you. And even, you know, in some markets, in books where I've only had male victims, they still put a terrified looking woman on the jacket. So I guess that's what sells. But to me, you know, when I am writing the about these themes, I think about my grandmother. I love my grandmother, but she was abused by my grandfather. And we would see her with a black eye or a broken arm, and we wouldn't say anything because it wasn't any of our business. And that silence did not help her. It helped my grandfather who was abusing her. And so when I write these stories, I feel like in some way I'm giving her a voice. I'm saying that it's wrong, and I'm doing something that very rarely happens in the real world, which I'm making sure that the perpetrator is punished.
So before we run out of time here, I would love to know from you, I read a fantastic piece in Entertainment Weekly talking about all the great TV and film adaptations that are coming out. Can you give us kind of a little preview of where we might look out for adaptations of your work?
No.
No.
It was such a long question. I just thought, why don't I screw with you? She's so sweet. She asked for it, right? So Pieces of Her has been optioned by the people who did Big Little Lies, the production company, and a fantastic person, actually. And, you know, when you're an author and some Hollywood people start calling you, sometimes you can just hear how full of shit they are because their voice literally gets muffled. But, I mean, she really got the characters. And I talked to a writer who's worked on House of Cards and Homeland, who really keyed into Andy and her journey and the whole stuff with Laura and all that. And a director who's worked on both of those projects, as well as Mad Men and ER and NYPD Blue and all these fantastic shows that I've watched for years. And she's interested in directing. And I mean, it's a great team if they can pull it off. And it's very flattering to have people who understand what you're doing as a writer and who really appreciate it.
That's so exciting. Congratulations. All right, so I think we'll open it up now if the audience has questions for Karin.
Right here. Okay. I just wanted to know the whole story that you wrote. How did you learn? Like, what did you learn? How did you progress through writing this book?
Well, so what did I learn through writing this book? Well, you know, a couple of things. I think it gave me more of appreciation for my nieces. You know, I remember when I watched Girls, and I hated it so much because I just thought, well, two things. One is I have no relation to these young women, right? I cannot understand anything they're doing because it's so different from my life, right? Which made me really angry because it means you're old. And the other thing was, it took me a while to realize that they weren't the heroes of the story. And then I really enjoyed it because I thought, this is what we fought for, is when women are represented, they can be their complete entire selves. And 20-year-old women are idiots, right? And they make stupid mistakes. And it's on the internet now, which, my God, if things I did in my 20s were we would not be here. And so it gave me an appreciation of that age group, and in writing from Andy's point of view gave me an appreciation for my nieces and what they have to go through, you know, because part of my anger over losing my youth was, you know, you have so many opportunities and you're not doing what I would do, but they have their own problems, you know, and that writing that character made me understand those problems. But then, you know, writing Laura also gave me a deeper understanding of where I am in the world. I mean, in a weird way. And I hate when writers stare at their navels and talk about the journey of the character and all that. So I'm not going to look at my navel, mostly because this woman's filming something. I'm terrified my shirt's too tight right here. But Thank you. But it did teach me a little things, and I'm much nicer to my nieces now. I'm not as hard on them because I kind of get what they're going through.
Did you have a question? Nope. Okay. I'll come around. Come and take it. Raise your hand again. There we go. Okay.
Hi. I just want to go back. You were talking about cults, and as someone that grew up with the horror of the beginning of the AIDS crisis, could you just explain why you used ACT UP with cults? That was just very disorienting to me.
Well, I'm sorry. I was talking about the anger that people felt, you know, and the isolation and the need to change things with violence. And I wouldn't necessarily ascribe cultism to that group. I was actually in Atlanta. I was in several rallies with ACT UP. And I mean, one of the things that was shocking to me writing about this book was just remembering the AIDS crisis and how many people were lost and how many people I knew who died. And then when I was working with Aid Atlanta and they developed the cocktail, how these men who had sold everything and given up on life and gone to hospices to die suddenly were living. But the anger that nothing was being done, the feeling that nothing was being done, that the abandonment, right? And so I didn't mean cult necessarily as in, you know, more like banding together and trying to do something about it. But I do, you know, wonder, because a lot of people were calling for violence during that time. And I think that advocating violence actually did a disservice. I think the things that changed people's opinion was the fact that you couldn't hide from it, that it was there, that Rock Hudson was on television, that Elizabeth Taylor was doing so much, Barbara Bush holding that baby, you know, Princess Diana. I mean, all of that came back to me when I was writing this, because I thought, yeah, this was such an angry time. But you talk to some people and they think the 80s were fantastic, right? Because they think, oh, well, you know, we had deregulation and tax cuts and all this other stuff. But people were dying and horrible deaths, and information was not getting out, and humanity was being lost. You know, and one of the other things I focus on in the book is the fact that funding from the federal government was cut for state mental hospitals during the 1980s. And so we have a lot of people now who are saying, you know, we've had someone commit an act of violence, which is very rare for people who have mental health issues to become violent. But, you know, people use that as a focal point, and they say, you know, what are we doing? How did that happen? Well, what we're doing is we're deregulating, and we're taking all the safety nets that help people away. And that's really started in the 1980s, first in California, then in the rest of the country. And what happened was people who needed help were kicked out into the street. They became homeless. They eventually became incarcerated, right? So this is a man-made disaster, in as much as not acknowledging the AIDS crisis was a man-made disaster. I mean, think of how many people died just for lack of information. So that's what I was referring to as the anger during the 1980s, because a lot of people think, you know, the 1960s and the 1970s and Patty Hearst and the sit-ins in the diner and the bus rides and all of this stuff, they associate those decades with people being angry. And I thought when I was writing this book, this is an opportunity to talk about the anger in the 1980s and how it persisted.
Thank you. It's just hearing that nomenclature under the heading of cult just was very jarring to me. So thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, I didn't make the transition correctly. Sorry.
Any other questions in the audience? Last chance? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much to Karin Slaughter and to Abby Endler.